During my two previous videos of this series, I covered Chinese civilization, as well as China's modern economy and politics, respectively. In this video, I'm going to be going over its military and foreign relations to see whether or not China can be the next big superpower. China has the largest military in the world in terms of manpower, unsurprisingly, given its very large population, along with the second or third most powerful military in the world. This military is divided by the Army, which operates on land, obviously, the Air Force in the skies, and the Navy in the sea. There's also a rocket force that deals with ballistic missiles, including nuclear weapons, as well as a strategic support force which covers cyber, electronic, and space warfare. Now, in the previous decade, many considered China's military to be the third most powerful in the world after the US's and Russia's. However, given Russia's pretty terrible conduct in Ukraine, I would probably say that China has a more powerful military than Russia's. The Chinese military is under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. Overall, China historically, at least since World War II, has been the most hesitant of powers to engage in military affairs abroad. This is in sharp contrast, say, the United States, the UK, or Russia. Nonetheless, being more hesitant doesn't mean that they've never engaged in military interventions. For example, China, 1 year after becoming an actual People's Republic of China under the Communist Party, took over Tibet. And they also intervened during the Korean War. One forgotten aspect of the Vietnam War is that in the aftermath of the US leaving, China actually invaded Vietnam. It also pushed buttons with Taiwan. But nonetheless, China has been relatively unengaged in outright military interventions for the most part, preferring to use its economic and political influence to rival all their powers in East Asia and the world as well. Some suspect that China will become more belligerent as it transforms from having a green water navy situated on the continental shelf to a blue water navy that can exert power over the open ocean. China has also built up naval bases in Djibouti, as well as intel bases in Myanmar. One area of maritime tension is the South China Sea, in which the Chinese have built man-made islands to expand their exclusive economic zone, much to the anger of Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, and others. On top of that, China's main source of economic growth are its trade relations. China is highly dependent on maritime trade routes defended by its rival, the United States. One core strategic choke point is the Strait of Malacca, in between the mainland of Malaysia/Singapore, as well as the Indonesian island of Sumatra. This is where much of China's oil supply comes from through these maritime trade routes. On top of that, China has been building islands in the South China Sea, not only expanding their exclusive economic zone, but also exerting their naval and military power in general. As a result of this encroachment into their territorial waters, the Filipinos have stayed close to the United States, a historic ally and former colonizer. Despite the less than stellar colonial history, they maintained close ties together as they both fought against the Japanese during World War II, and today the Philippines is the most pro-American country in the world by population. And their military and political system is also heavily entrenched into the Washington sphere of influence. A little bit more surprising is Vietnam, which despite the Vietnam War has moved to be closer to the United States, although not an ally. It's an authoritarian regime which makes a close relationship kind of hard, but Vietnam is very concerned with Chinese aggression. Because of these maritime challenges, China has oftentimes focused less on water and more on land through the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a vast set of infrastructure projects of railway, roads, electrical grids, and others that will interconnect China's trade on the Eurasian landmass and, to a lesser extent, Africa. This has been in many ways a phenomenal success in some countries, but also less important in others, oftentimes just being rubber stamps. The Belt and Road Initiative really depends on a country-by-country basis in terms of its amount of influence. The relationship between Russia, for example, is incredibly important as they have a lot of interconnection. However, China's Belt and Road Initiative programs with Italy are by and large nothing than just, hey, we have a treaty. Noticeably, countries not on the Belt and Road Initiative are Japan and India. The rivalry between Japan and China has been long-lasting and quite well known. The two countries are arch rivals in the East Asia region, and on top of that, there's a great deal of resentment towards Japanese war crimes against Chinese people during World War II. On top of that, Japan is a liberal democracy today and is deeply connected with the West as it is a G7 nation. To this day, less than 10% of Japanese people view China positively. In between those two juggernauts is Korea, namely North and South Korea. China is an ally of North Korea, however, it by and large is an ally of convenience, knowing full well how batshit crazy North Korea is. It, however, still needs to rely on an alliance with North Korea because it doesn't want a unification between North and South Korea. Given the fact that South Korea is far more prosperous, this would mean that a US ally would be on their doorstep. Despite this very close relationship between South Korea and the US, relations between South Korea and China are still fairly friendly, and they have deep economic and cultural ties. However, the South Koreans have not been as fond of China's support for North Korea, as well as their use of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Nonetheless, the two countries do share a shared camaraderie over the resentment towards Japanese war crimes, partially as a result of South Korea's friendly relationship with China and its hostility towards Japan. The notion of a unified version of NATO in the Asia-Pacific region led by the US becomes rather difficult given the fact that some of its key allies like Japan and South Korea bicker a lot. In sharp contrast to NATO and Europe, the US maintains bilateral alliances rather than a multilateral alliance. This means that the US has relations individually with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand. However, many of those countries don't necessarily get along with each other. China maintains a far smaller alliance system in the region, including countries like Cambodia and Myanmar, which are far weaker. One area of particular interest is Australia, an Anglophone liberal democracy very similar to the United States, and is actually one of China's most important trading partners, as Australia produces a lot of the mineral supply for the Chinese juggernaut. Australia's major military partner is still the United States, and given the cultural similarities, it is very unlikely that China will ever surpass the United States as Australia's major partner. China is also a major rival with India. Despite being close to each other, the two countries have only been at war once in recent memory, and even then it was pretty minor. This is primarily due to the Himalayan mountains blocking the two countries' major population centers. Nonetheless, China has forged quite close relations with Pakistan instead of India, and this has caused serious tension. Part of the reason why the Kashmir territorial dispute exists between India and Pakistan is because of Chinese trade routes and military trade routes through Pakistan into much of the Indian Ocean. On top of that, China has also invested in ports of the Bay of Bengal in Bangladesh, thereby further isolating India in a region that by and large doesn't get along with it. Then lies Russia. Russia and China have fairly friendly relations. This is despite having a brief spat during the Cold War during the Sino-Chinese split, in which the two countries were fairly antagonistic. However, nonetheless, the two countries do get fairly along well due to their opposition to Western interventions and their support for other authoritarian regimes. However, Russia has been fairly hesitant regarding Chinese immigration to Siberia and the growing Chinese population in sharp contrast to ethnic Russians. China and Russia are seen as two major rivals against Western power. They tend to vote alongside each other at the UN Security Council, showing a certain degree of solidarity between autocratic regimes, whereas the US, UK, and France tend to vote together in the opposite direction. However, there is some dispute in Central Asia over who can influence the region the most. Both China and Russia have also invested in the African continent, much to the chagrin of France and to a lesser extent the United States. However, much of the influence of China has been overstated. So let's go to the relationship with the United States, as it is the most important relationship of this century. The US and China are not sworn enemies, nor are they allies, but rather partners and rivals in a very complex and interconnected relationship. Some have brought up the concept of Thucydides' trap, a situation during the classical era in which the dominant power Athens was rivaled by the rival power Sparta, leading to the Peloponnesian War. Could this potentially lead to a war between the US and China? Well, the answer is I can't predict the future, and we really don't know for sure. A war between the US and China, while unlikely at this very moment, is still very possible. However, it would lead to a massive amount of devastation for both countries, as they're both nuclear-armed powers. China holds a great deal of US dollars as a reserve currency, while the US is the most important export market for China. This would devastate both economies and make it unlikely that any sort of war could occur between the two. This is not to say that the two will become super best friends. After all, they hold diametrically opposed ideologies on how to run governance, autocracy versus democracy. The US still takes issue with a great deal of currency manipulation and China's theft of intellectual property. Meanwhile, China has a great deal of issues with American military intervention as well as protectionist measures on free trade. If there ever is a violent conflict, it would probably be over the autonomy of Taiwan, and this could be absolutely devastating for everyone involved. Taiwan is a US ally and a major source of not only economic power, but also a major producer of semiconductors, essential to the digital economy. That subject is one for another video that I'll discuss in more detail. In the meantime, I'm going to pivot to another subject that may prohibit China from becoming a world superpower, and that's its one-child policy, which was once put into place, and has now become a 2 and later 3-child policy. This has created a demographic crisis. Chinese parents oftentimes prefer sons who can provide for them, as well as their families. However, this has led to a lopsided demographic market in which Chinese men have trouble finding wives, and this has led to a decrease in families and a decrease in the population. So what can we assess from this situation? Well, this might lead to a massive demographic crisis in the country, as there's a very large population of elderly people that need to be taken care of by an ever small number of working-age people. Save for significant technological advances, this could be the #1 factor in China being in decline. Its population has already stagnated and will most likely decline in the coming decades, and this could be absolutely devastating. Nonetheless, I do think China does have a great deal of potential. In sharp contrast to another autocratic country like Russia, it has seen a tremendous amount of positive growth over the past several years. And on top of that, it hasn't gotten itself too involved in foreign quagmires. If anything, China has enriched itself under the system that the US set up to begin with. And the Chinese may even want to continue the American-led order because they've gotten so wealthy under it without getting themselves entangled in so many quagmires. The decisions Chinese officials make in the coming years will tell us what will happen in the coming decades. Will China try to take over Taiwan and upend the Western liberal order, or will it choose to stay in the Western liberal order while maintaining its autocratic system and getting richer and richer? It's difficult to tell what their decisions will be. I want everyone to note, who's listening, that you'll see plenty of videos discussing the geopolitics of China in particular that tend to overstate their success or overstate their failures, oftentimes telling you that China's in the midst of a collapse or China's going to destroy the West. These are hyperbolic garbage pieces that are not there to tell you a nuanced projection of what the future will tell us. Chances are China will maintain its status as a great power. Will it become the world's sole superpower? Well, it looks highly unlikely for the foreseeable future. Nonetheless, what is true is China's remarkable longevity. This is a civilization that dates all the way back to the classical age and will most likely survive long after we're all gone. Thanks for watching.